Those of you who have been seeing these tapes the last few weeks, and even those of you seeing these tapes in other times and other places, you will have noted a few weeks back I began to refer to some of this activity as being an exploration. And instead of talking about real revolutionists as I had for the last months, I started referring to explorers. And I even one night, as I started doing that, I whipped out that kind of example, and I was referring to, as a metaphorical springboard, I was referring to, I pulled out Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand after they run off those naughty Muslims and settled down, and they financed Columbus. And I was using him as a tropic example of coming to a new world. Now, of course, I could have used Elizabethan England and other places, Portugal. But since I keep dragging that up, since I once did it, I keep referring it back, but I thought that we would try and pull your brains out as though they were large-sized Trojans and that your head was a large organ that perhaps it deserved to be stretched, whatever that is that had to fit over it. But keeping in mind what I said, since I kept jumping back and saying things for the last few weeks about Columbus having to go back and face King Ferdinand and the old world. And I've even started using old world intelligence as a term. But now consider this. All of that, old world intelligence. Because I am not inclined, I'll tell you now, to abandon that in the next few nights. It has a very good allegorical base, an elusive base, because you could look upon the old world, keeping in mind right quick for the hardwired material launching pad for this, those kinds of expeditionary forces, those explorers such as Columbus, forget all the real so-called early history of people who might have touched on the North American continent, because remember, this is not a history lesson. But look at Columbus and look at him coming here, and it was a whole new world. And he came from a place that was just beginning to settle down. The church was beginning to settle down. States were beginning to settle down some kind of boundaries. Europe was out of the Dark Ages, because it's just common knowledge all over Europe at that time. People were going, aren't you glad the Middle Ages are over? And people say, yeah, right on. So you had this going on. And so he got over here, and then you started having other people come over. Let's just, for a second, use Columbus. There he is, and he hangs around here, and it's a new world. And the human intellect, of course, it would be to go into brand new territories inside the brain itself, into areas now not being used. Everybody knows they're there. Even doctors, if you want to talk about, just medical science knows the parts of the brain, there seems to be juice running around the edges of it, or maybe through it, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything. Just staying warm, breathing, getting a little blood, but just laying there. The New World, the North American continent, the secret, fast way to Cathay, to the Indies. But now, using all those terms, what I wanted to point out to you, there's nothing wrong with the old world, if you're looking at it from that viewpoint. There's nothing any more wrong with the old world than there would be anything wrong with history as a social science. Because there'd be nothing wrong with a person reading history, investigating history, but just reading history for fun. But who, attempting to pass as a reasonable person, would want to, or try to, go back and relive history? Now, when you get into the human nervous system, I must propose to you that that is exactly what takes place. That is the basis of the stability of civilization. That is, of the mass collection of human nervous systems. Not only does the nervous system, not only does the human brain like history, it relives history. And that's what I was trying to ask you that not many of you seem to let flow through your gills a few minutes ago. That'd be quite proper. Nothing wrong if you had such an interest to pick up history books. Check them out of the library, sit around and read about history. But who, if you could, would want to go back and have to relive it? I don't mean because there's anything wrong with it, but you've read about some fucking history. You read about it. Maybe you read about 2 or 3 versions of it. You read about it several times. You thought, boy, that was neat. Now, after doing all of that, why would you, if you had the ability, then want to go back and actually go through it? Why? That's why a good mother would be following around somebody like on a motorcycle or a bucking bronco. A good mother would be hollering, you know, get off, you get hurt. You don't do that. Go read a book about it. The human intellect continues to use that which is history to it and relive it. If that was the case, if that was a proper case, there would be no exploration whatsoever. Wherever life started on this planet, if it could be pinpointed to some little locale, if we were going to look at all of life and we could pinpoint it down to one cell, that one cell would now be not only the old world, it would be all of the world. It would have never changed, it would have never expanded. The intelligence of man would have never gone into any new territory. Now those who become explorers, I was going to point out some of what might seem to be the possible motivations behind those who want to go out and be a Columbus or a Balboa or a Magellan. Now, of course, one that might strike you is those seeking adventure. Are we talking about Columbus and Magellan? Or are we talking about something else? I don't know. Would be those seeking adventure. There are also those that would apparently, looking at historically from all accounts, would be seeking wealth to go to a new place. To come up with an exclusive franchise to deal with the new territory, assuming you discover a new territory and you don't get killed in the process. It has always been, if you can arrange through your benefactor, whoever paid for the trip, if you can arrange to become franchised to have an exclusive market of dealing with the new territory, I can assure you that you are in line to be wealthy. There were people who left, if we were still talking about explorers, who left the old world, went off on expeditions in the attempt to escape pending problems they had. Financial, legal, social. But to most ordinary people, those kind of problems normally have to do with some kind of friction between them and the state. But problems sent many people out. There were other people that would seek to be explorers on the basis of trying not to simply escape physical out there problems, but were attempting to escape like a moribund milieu, a worn out society. They did not necessarily wax so poetically or philosophically. The kinds of people that normally become explorers are not so inclined. But I assure you that there were some of them that, in their own way, if you were to jump out of the bushes and holler, "Hey, Vesputin," or where it was, "why are you here?" and you talk to him for a while, it would turn out that you could see that my description just now verbally would not be ill-appropriate to some of those. That they went, well, it was like life was becoming just such a predictable, such a worn-out, day-by-day affair, no new ideas, nothing going on. And I heard about this. I heard that there were theories that maybe you could sail out this way and find something new, and it was just irresistible. I don't know whether I'll get rich and famous off of it. I don't know what will happen. But I just couldn't stay there anymore. It was having a kind of crude awareness that the background, putting it in ordinary terms, their society, their ideas, the interest of their particular civilization had just worn itself out. It was just burnout. Other aspects that I wanted to mention of exploration. Those that went out exploring, not only some of the reasons, but some other connections there too. The way they went about it, if you notice historically, if we're indeed still talking about real explorers, they all had to have a patron. And your ordinary intelligence, your old world intelligence might immediately say, well, yeah, because they had to have somebody such as a king with enough money to finance the trip. That sure does seem like a cheap, obvious response to it, doesn't it? It's why don't you hear of freelance explorers? Out of all the history that you've ever read, why was there not somebody somewhere that had enough money on his own and went, I'm going to sail away. I'm going to sail off to that place that people are trying to find. I got the money. I'm not doing anything else. I'll go do it. I don't know of any such. Why? They all apparently needed a patron. I mean, that's the way life had arranged itself. I went through all of that last few minutes in response to the kind of ordinary old line intelligence that could say that, well, you've got to have large sums of money to finance such an expedition, and only a patron of some sort. Only a very rich merchant or banker and probably a king could afford to do it. But notice none of the kings did it. None of their sons did it. Life was arranged in such a way that those that sailed off always required the backing of somebody. Now think about it just a second. Seems like I'm having a hard time getting you people up to speed tonight. Also remember, I'm not going to admit it outright, but I may not simply be talking about the Magellans and the Cabots of the world. We may be talking about something else inside. They apparently have got to have someone that sends them, that authorizes them to go. Not just the money. I hope some of you people seeing this at another time in another place, I hope you're having a little more success with this than these people here. All right, how about this? Let me give a real strong hint that I'm not talking about explorers. I don't have any interest in that. They were talking about the operations of the human nervous system. And people try in all forms to improve themselves. And fooling around with what I'm doing, I have narrowed it down for you. You should be able to see that if anything is going to ever make sense, if there's going to be any sort of new information, it's not going to come about physically if we're going to divide up the human organism. You're not going to get so strong, so lithe, so supple. You're not going to get so big or so small that suddenly you're going to become enlightened in some way, that you're going to become the smartest person in the world through some kind of super duper, heretofore unheard of runner's high. That you're going to run so far that you just suddenly your brain's going to explode, and you're going to make Aristotle, the Buddhas, the Confuciuses of their time just look like nothing. That's not going to happen. And it's not going to come about to divide up the human organism, the human system, into more artistic areas. If we could split up the human being into that, you're not going to write a piece of music, paint a picture, write a poem, enter into a love affair, find a religion, find some ritual that it within itself is going to make everything self-explanatory. You're not going to become in some way enlightened through that. If anything is going to make sense, it is going to happen through the high end of the nervous system, the verbal area. Now, back to what I was asking. Do any of you find it interesting that those little explorers, think about perhaps some neurons, some potential connections. Think about little molecular explorers in your brain, and they want to go out. They want to think a new thought, find a new idea. Or to put it a little bit better, let's go whole hog. They'd like to know what the hell is going on here in life. Nobody else seems to know. And you keep thinking, many people do, that there's been people who did know here and there. I'm almost sure of it. And of course I've hinted to you that there are people even alive right now. They got a pretty good idea of what's going on. And so you feel that call. But no explorer goes out in history that did not seem to have had a patron. Why? I don't know. Since so many of you seem to be stuck up somewhere around the Cape Verde Islands, I don't think we're going to get any further. All right. Other things that seem to be necessary historically, I wasn't talking about the nervous system, forget that. We're talking about, my only interest in this is historical. They all seem to have not only needed a patron, but they needed a home port. And it seems to be on the basis, I suggest to you, that perchance at the very least, that they need somewhere to come back to. Now you might think right quick, well, wait a minute. If one of these explorers, and he hears all these stories and there's these tales about far across this water is a land that is paradise. And he comes up with a patron that's, all right, I'll pay for it. You know, be sure and bring me back some pieces of paradise, and you know, if it's a real easy trip, and try and smooth things down, because of course I'll probably want to go sometime. And the guy says, right. Why is it they don't sail off and never come back? All explorers, if they live, always return. Why don't they just stay there? All right, it's more than that. It's a little more subtle, is what I asked before. I asked, why don't they stay there? It is as though, I suggest to you, that they have got to have a home port. They have got to have somebody that sent them out, and I'm suggesting that may be tied to the feeling that, well, I've got to go back to at least report to the king. I owe him that courtesy. But could you also see the possibility that life has the molecular structure of things arranged that when they start drifting off and going into new areas, that these little molecules, these little cells, need to feel as though, well, I can always go back. I might get out there, maybe out toward the way past Cape Verde, and if I get frightened, at least I can come home. Because Ferdinand paid for it. If I can come back and say, the ship wasn't handling right, and it was your ship, you know, Your Holiness, Your Highness, and I knew how much you had paid for this, and I didn't want to go out there and just sink the mother, so I brought it back until we can get things straightened out. But if you don't have a home port, if you don't have a patron, think about it a second. You might just sail out and you get out there and you get frightened, you get disturbed, you get disappointed. What are you going to do? It doesn't feel like that you are responsible to anybody. You're almost on your own. So, even explorers, if we're now talking about the great Polos and the Raleighs and all of them, they don't be on their own, surely. They were explorers in name, but notice they all had a patron, they all had a home port, they all finally went home. But I'm telling you even more so, they all wanted to know that there is a place I can go back to. Too many of you are missing the more refined parts of this. It's not that the explorer has got to go back. That's not the point. They all have. But that's not the point. They don't have to. But they have got to know that they can. But the subtle part you're missing is you can say, well, anybody that sails off can come back somewhere. Columbus didn't have to come back to Spain. He could decide, oh, to hell with that. I'll take another route home, and he could end up in France. And like the people a lot better, never going back to Spain. You're still not getting it. There has got to be the knowledge of the molecules involved, the cells involved, that not only can I go back, but there's a place to go back to, there's a place to which I should go back. There's a place, if I do go back, that there is no question as to where I will go back. In Columbus's case, it was to go back to Spain. Maybe he only stayed a day or so, I don't remember, and just reported and went back to Italy. But he knew that there's one place that was proper to return to. That is a part of the stabilizing, that is a part of the limiting process, the system of the way the human nervous system, the way the human brain operates. I was mentioning that one of the reasons I was suggesting, amongst other possibilities of why explorers went out, was for wealth, and I mentioned the exclusive franchise. Connected with that, running at a kind of parallel fifth dimension between that and a place to return to, is all the explorers also, let me refine it a little bit, seem to have wanted, perhaps needed, some kind of investiture that not just necessarily financially franchised to do business exclusively, but a kind of investiture. Do you remember that the church used to give to tell people, go over there and go over and conquer those people over the hill, and if you do and turn them into Christians, you can be king. In other words, giving away that which you don't own, which historically and politically, if you were a critical part of life's body, if you had such a pitiful job, you could say, boy, the nerve of the church. Not the church, it's life. Life sends parts of its own self out to new areas and says, if you can go over there and operate, you're in charge. But put back in the apparent external level, it does sound odious, egregious to a civilized, probably intelligent man or woman, that the church, it was not just the Christian church, but I'm picking that one out, would tell some out of work or between job tyrant, some knights, say, there's this tribe that we heard about that's up there right past, you go up to Copenhagen and you take a left and you swim over there, and there's this group of people and nobody can seem to do anything with them. If you'll go over there and convert them into Christians, me, Pope so-and-so or Cardinal so-and-so, I'm telling you, you can pick out a name. You can think about it on the way, and you can be king of those people. I give you the investiture that if you turn them into Christians and do the right thing so that they'll be serving God and they're at least paying homage to the right God, you can be king. And guys would run off and do that. Like, why not? But from an ordinary, external, intelligent view, intellectual view, you would say, well, that is really a bit much for somebody to give away, to say you can have those people if you'll go and make Christians out of them. The church didn't do that. Life did that. Life does that within its own operations. That is part of the problem that everyone in your own nervous system is faced with. The cells do not talk in such a manner, certainly, but that is what they're faced with. This is, I want you to try and see a connection, part of me pointing out to you historically that all of these explorers sailed off, and everyone that's ever been noted by history and remembered had a patron and had a place to return to, and did so. And the more subtle part I'm telling you, it's not that they had to, but it's that they had to. They had to know. The explorers need a kind of investiture. They need to feel, not only from a king, it could be from apparently inside of your own nervous system, it could apparently be from even a parallel. Some ordinary people, they might think even a higher authority, like God sent me. Now, Columbus, it could have happened that he was sailing along and here come some other ships. It looks like it's going to be a race to see who finds the shortcut, who discovers the North American continent, at least the European discovery of it, the 15th century version of it. And you might holler, who financed you? And the guy could holler, the Pope. The church itself sent me. There are people who believe that they're trying to make some sense out of life, that they're trying to in some way improve themselves, not physically, not financially, not emotionally, but in some way that they may or may not be able to describe. But their feeling is, if there is some motivating force, if there is some authorization for me trying this, it is indeed not of this world. As your forefathers used to say, God is making me try and think godly thoughts. Or the powers of the universe are trying to make me think universally. That I have been given an investiture to go into new areas of my own nervous system, my own consciousness. But this is not simply me fooling around. That's part of what makes this so tricky when it's operating in life in a certain way, because people normally, if they're attracted to something that supposedly is going to, or promises some new insight, or if not some great intellectual, personal breakthrough, they always have some kind of investiture. They always have at least a name. And they say what it's based on. It's based on some sort of current psychological breakthrough, some new drugs, a reinterpretation of some old religion or some old idea. But there is an investiture that if you attempt to follow this system, these methods of self-improvement, of mind control, of self-improvement in general, that it's based upon something. Somebody has authorized this. Dr. So-and-so's work was not recognized particularly even up until the time of his death in 1928. But my brother-in-law studied it for years, helped me to it. I brought it up to date. And you may have never heard of Dr. whoever he was that died in 1928. But there's always some sort of authorization for it. That's what people need. It is expected that if you walked in or you found a brochure for something that says how to be more intelligent, and you read it and you liked it and it said show up for a meeting tonight, and you showed up for a free meeting, and they said, well, first off, all of you, I assume you read our brochure and you showed up here. Let me tell you, this is not just some wild notion I cocked up. Have any of you ever heard of Dr. So-and-so? And nobody in the room's ever heard of him. And he says, well, it's not surprising. The man died. His work was not recognized. He died in 1928. And they give you a little breakdown right quick. He was born in Austria. He ended up, and he lived most of his life in New Jersey, and he died there. His papers had never, he had one small little pamphlet that he published himself. But at any rate, several people got interested in his work shortly after he died, and they worked on it, and then my brother-in-law got involved, and then I was dying of cancer, and he got me interested in it, and I set up reading all his papers, and I don't know the exact connection on how to describe it, but I did not die. You see, now I'm healthy. I have studied all of his papers. I have reinterpreted them, and at any rate, I want you people to know that's the basis of the ideas that you read in the brochure. You do understand that that would satisfy anybody in the crowd. I mean, some other people might say, can we read the papers, or can you tell us more about it? But nobody's going to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, I thought the ideas were pretty good in this brochure, but for you to say they're based on those things of Dr. Killebrew, I never heard of him, I'm leaving. That doesn't happen. The people say, well, you probably never heard of him, he was not recognized, but that is the basis of what our methods are. And people who were interested enough to show up, the kind that's wired up in life's body to be there, will go, okay, oh, okay, good. That there was some investiture. Now it ranges from that to, of course, showing up, and God says, well, I got some real interesting stuff to tell you, and God told it to me. I'm in constant contact with God, He speaks to me. And that's where it came from. So you got all the way from that to Dr. Killebrew. But there is always some investiture for people to sail off. Always. I ask you again, do you know of anybody in history, his history, ever noted a guy in a little rowboat, or maybe he had a small outboard, and he looks out and hears about Columbus and all them, and he thinks, well, hell, I don't know the king, I don't even want to fool with kings, I see them from afar, I don't like them, they stink, and he gets in his own boat and he takes off to try and find the shortcut to India. Have you ever heard of that? No. Never. They want somebody. That's the way your life is. Somebody with some apparent authorization, some sovereignty, whether it be temporal or otherwise or spiritual, somebody to authorize me to do this, to finance me, not just monetarily, but in every possible way. I am brave, I'll go out, I may die, nobody else wants to do it, but I'll do it, because I'm Columbus. But who will sponsor me? Not just money, but he'll say, I'll do it. Remember, it's not been too long ago I pointed out to you, and I asked you the question, I asked you, could you see that there's hardly any such thing in the world as somebody working by themselves? A one-man operation, whether it be an explorer, a blacksmith, a computer hacker at home, a gardener, an attorney, a doctor. They always got to have somebody. If it's just a secretary, if it's just a yes man, everybody apparently has got to have somebody before they can even do anything. Solitary acts. I want to be a painter. I can stay at home, and if I catch on, I don't have to dress up, I don't even have to bathe, I just paint. Well, let's see. What I need first, of course, is a manager or something. And there you go. I'll be an attorney. I'll be a psychiatrist. I'll put a little booth out like the comic strip, and I'll say, advice, $5. Well, let's see. Where should I put the booth? I ought to check. I guess I'll check with the Small Business Administration, or I'll call the American Psychiatric. Everybody will end up dragging at least somebody else into it, that they just do not go do it. Nobody just goes and sails away. Are we still talking about do-it-yourself or street corner psychiatry? Are we talking about Magellan? Are we talking about Columbus? Do any of you suspect I'm probably not? Or if I am, wondering why I am? There is another, I suggest to you, interesting, just everyday historical type of question, because I don't see this happening much right now, but that's not the problem. Let me ask you this. If you were faced with this, and you could float around in history like you should be able to, not worrying about the ordinary restraints of whether something's already happened or not, but let me ask you this. How does a brand new bloodline, a royal bloodline, ever get started? Now, we're not talking about some Kmart tyrant, some general that happens throughout history that comes in and takes over. Well, let's say he takes over well enough, and he can read and write maybe, or he wants to be able to, and he pictures himself, he keeps hearing about King Philip over here, and Alfred the semi-great over there. And he takes a look at himself and he thinks, sure, I don't cut such a bad figure if I'd take a bath and clean up. I'd like to be a king. I'd like to be a king. But how do you become a king? How are you going to start a brand new royal bloodline? Now, I've got to tell you, I don't know how much, if any, it's ever come out in the ordinary world, out in the old world, but people have been faced with this. People not involved with this. Not speaking metaphorically, people have been faced with this. I guess you can ask yourself again whether I'm actually talking about that or not, at least for a minute. But they have been faced with, how do I suddenly become a king? You know, it's me and it's all my henchmen, all my yes men. We're now in charge. My mother and father were both semi-feral. I'm not even sure who my father was. They're not around. I wouldn't speak to them if they were here. How am I going to suddenly become royal? Nobody else that's already an established royal bloodline is going to. I mean, you'd have to have a prince somewhere, a prince-in-law, in terrible straits. But somebody from a good established royal bloodline somewhere, even if they're temporarily out of office, if not out of sorts. If they're part of an old line, you're going to have your hands full to get them over there to play this game about, yes, you're part of us, or I recognize your bloodline. It just doesn't happen. It's awfully hard, unless you've got a lot of money and the church was in bad shape, to get the Pope to show up. But even if somebody would do it, you understand, the guy would still think, and of course he'd think people think it, which is the only thing that matters. He would think, well, even if I did, I heard about Alfred the half-great, that he has a brother-in-law that just got out of jail up there around the North Sea, and I'd get him down here since he's got some credentials and sober him up and straighten him up, and we'll throw this big coronation and we'll have him do it, to say that as being the brother-in-law to Alfred the once was great, that I hereby recognize you as King Willy Bully the First. He thinks to himself, well, even if I did that and I can get him down here and he's got some questionable credentials, that's still not going to mean anything to anybody, because it's still a matter. I came from nowhere. They know I came out of the woods. They know I just started bathing myself a few months ago. So just because he does that. So how do you get a bloodline started? How? Would you entertain for a second that we've got no interest in royal bloodlines and coronations and all of that? To do this, how do you ever know what you're doing? Well, a real explorer, a real revolutionist even, is through your own new intelligence, you have to ultimately recognize, authorize, and crown yourself. And in doing this at the greatest extreme, that becomes a part of what I just went through all this little mumbo-jumbo historically about, is that people want the feeling that somebody with authority has crowned me, that I am indeed now the beginning of some new royal bloodline, and I want somebody to do it. That's why I started out with this as an apparent historical inquiry, at least rhetorically, about how does a new royal house ever get started. It is within the nervous system, within the human brain itself, that if you come up with something new, if you indeed went into new territories, if indeed you were on the verge, as far as you're concerned, we're right there, that you were establishing a whole new royal bloodline, you by yourself, you still are wanting somebody to come up with a sword. You're wanting pomp and circumstance. Not just literally. You're wanting the whole aura, all of the workings, the background of some established old world authority to say, I crown you King so-and-so, to validate what you're doing. The sketchiness of all of this, what makes it so much fun, and so hard to find listed in the yellow pages, is that you've got to ultimately do it yourself. Now, out in the ordinary world, which has, of course, its reflection in here ordinary world with ordinary people, there have been, for a second you might find them interesting because they still have significance and implications to people individually. To start at one extreme, the great all-purpose umbrella policy, if you could get into it, would be somebody like a Moses. Start the Jewish house of David. You know, he goes off and comes back. God said you're in charge. And of course there are versions of that in every part of this world, by just using one you know. Catholic Church fooled around and there was too much written history, and anyway, they had to come up with their own version. If you remember, they had to go back and somebody finally remember words supposedly Jesus said, and they went, what he went was, he authorized, who it was, Peter, he authorized him. We just let a couple of hundred years slip by here, however long it was, before we actually got ourselves together and kept it going. But yes, there is a royal bloodline. And they all kind of look like, is anybody going to say no? And by then the Catholic Church was like the new version of the Roman Empire, and there was nobody around to tell them no. And they went, it was like they waited to hear a then great outcry, and there was none, and they kind of straightened their robes and said, yes, that's exactly the way it happened. But at any rate, Moses, there's a great example. He goes off, just to take the story real simply, he goes off and comes back, and he's king, damn it. You don't ask him, who made you king? Case closed. I mean, there's nothing else to say. He said, I'm king. Right, there's that. And I said that historically people have fooled with it in life and they're not sure what to call it. I've seen it happen in our lifetime. You say, it's life at work now. It's not having anything to do with the people. But I have seen this, and it's happened historically, but I have seen it in the last few years. This happened, I guess, an outgrowth of the 60s, this guru syndrome where there being people around that were ipse-dixit spiritual teachers. And they all, if you recall, throughout history, but even right until now, all try to claim some authorization that I studied with Yogi so-and-so, who actually in person studied with grandfather Yogi, who died in 1890. And that, so they always use that, or I met him once. I slept with his granddaughter. She said she was his granddaughter. But there's another one. What I was going to tell you, there's another one. It is an attempt. It's not that they're doing anything extraordinary based on understanding, but I have seen them attempt to do this recently. It's an attempt to leapfrog over your own back. Because what I've seen a couple of them do is suddenly announce, or have somebody else announce, that they are now an authorized teacher of the version of this guy who was trying to start his own royal line. And so it's like, well, you look at this, and so now there's people out who are his followers and now have been ordained by him. It retroactively makes him royal himself. That has been done back in history. I wasn't trying, as I said, trying to give you a history lesson, but there have been people, life has attempted to do that, is that you bestow royalty on somebody else and then get them recognized at all. But at least you get recognized that they say, I am now the spiritual, at least blood spiritual, son of so-and-so. And if you're interested in that at all, whether you're a great father, if you're interested at all, then you look at him, and then you look at who he says was the person who ordained me, and you look, and there stands the person. They're kind of a step higher than the person they ordained, looking as regal as they can, looking as wise as they can. And it's almost as though you have tried to jump over your own back, and by authorizing somebody else to be royal, and nobody laughs, you tried, like the Catholic Church did, you announced that here's royalty. And so some people look and go, oh, okay. And so if they buy that, then suddenly you understand you're royal, or else how did you make him royal? And that nobody called your hand. We got to turn the tape over. There's much more, but let me bring it down to at least one simple point before I go on, try to give you a center to it. All of me talking about these explorers going off and having to have, apparently, the need for some authorization. That people do not, the explorers do not provision, finance, chart, plan themselves and sail off. They got to find somebody in the old world. They got to find the establishment, even if the establishment is dying. They apparently have got to have somebody, and from a sense, forget the money now. Let's assume that they had the money. That almost for no reason to get somebody with the appearance of some authorization to say, all right, I'll break a bottle of beer on your ship and I'll be there and I'll wave and say, go with God. Good luck, bon voyage. That they've got to have somebody to do it. And then all the little other aspects I was trying to turn you towards about the kind of investiture that they're even granting you, apparently from a 3D view, they're granting you ownership of things they do not own if you'll go there and do it. But yes, whatever you have, whatever you find over there, you can keep it. Well, you keep 90%. Bring me back 10% on the investment. Rest of it, what you got, you can keep it. I said so. Good. That's what I wanted to hear. Why do you want to hear that? A guy can go off by himself and everything he gets, he can keep it all. Why does he need a king? Why does he need somebody to apparently say, all right, you go there, and whatever you find, you can keep most of it. All of this has to do a more centralized verbal core is a matter of validation. The same as my question is, how do you start a brand new royal bloodline? Who's going to say that not only are you king, but you're part of a kingly line? That in some way retroactively, some way magically to cloud everybody's mind, and you suddenly be king and nobody say, wait a minute, I used to know him when he drove a cab. I knew his father. His father wasn't no king. To suddenly, that you have jumped into the genetic pattern, the DNA chain running, and you in some way have not only jumped back and redone part of it retroactively, which you have to do if you're going to jump back, thank you, but then in some way the other parallel, interested, huddling about other DNA lines, in some way you kind of cloud their mind and they think that guy's line has always been stupor mundi. They have always been royal. It all is a matter of a kind of validation. And I threw in that when it gets to it and you understand it, ultimately someone doing this through your own intelligence, through the intelligence of new areas, you ultimately have got to recognize, you have got to authorize, you have got to crown yourself. That's it. There is no other way. But at least I'll leave it there, and that may sound either confusing, simplistic, nonsensical. Let me point out, you should be learning an example, learning a lesson from life, because likewise, partially through man, life is continually validating itself. Is part of why you seem to be involved, you and everyone else, with interest. That if you look at it from a certain view, if you can sail away, if you can get out of the side of Spain, and just get out there on the waters a little bit, got time to reflect, and you kind of look around, and you realize what you were up to back in the old land, and what you normally think about, and you ask, of what personal profit has that been to me? Your answer would be, do you realize that life is in a continual process of authorizing itself, of investituring itself? It is validating itself continually, and a part of it, the part that should be of some concern to you, is it is validating itself continually through man, and continually through the highest part of man into the verbal part of the human nervous system. The kind of validation it needs below a verbal level, I must point out to you, just trust me, I'm not going to try to prove it, it couldn't be proven, but it could get by. If it was just a non-verbal, if it was just physical validation, it has enough just on this planet. Let's just worry about this planet for the time being. It has enough creatures, it has enough organisms, it has enough cellular, molecular activity going on that below the verbal level, does not necessarily need man for that kind of validation. You understand? The food chain, if you want to look at it that way, if you want me to make it a little more direct, the food chain, taking outside man's verbal participation therein, outside of that, things could get by. The food chain could hold up. That is, we still had man, but non-verbally. It could still hold up. The validation that is important now is the validation that man singularly provides. That exploration, the exploration in the human nervous system in the new world. Even the old world in the human nervous system talks, but the new world is the new territories is a place that has not just a new language, it's got no language. You've got to bring the language there. It has no royalty, it has no social mores, it has no customs, it has no court. Whatever it is, you've got to take it there. The only validation you got is you. And yet the human nervous system is not set up to do that. There are many people who think they want to sail off to some new place. No matter how they think about it, they've always wanted to. Whether they think about it mystically, religiously, intellectually, artistically, but nobody wants to go alone. All right, I'll put it to you that way. Nobody can go alone. It's not because they're weak or dumb or fearful. That's why I started out asking you, does anybody know in history of any explorer that sailed off by himself without some authorization? The answer is no. And I keep trying to ask, using 3D language, about, well, there's got to be guys around that had the spirit of adventure somewhere, that got enough money, they're retired, they're laying around. Why didn't they go do it? Now, some of you don't know, there were some explorers that were not that strapped for cash. And they still went and found a cardinal, a prince, or a king, or somebody for them to say, will you send me off to the new world? Will you send me off to search? Knights, if it's getting too confusing, knights wandering around. Horses, they got their shields and they got their swords and they want to do something. There's nothing to do, and they'll find some king somewhere or some out-of-work prince, some disreputable prince, and they'll say, send me off on a great mission. And they may say, well, I don't know any. He'll say, well, make up one, send me off. And they say, well, go out and find that which was lost and nobody even knew it was lost. And then that says, thank you, my liege, thank you, I will go. All right, you left. That is exactly what is going on in the human nervous system. Now, people saying that I want to get beyond the limits of what it is I think. But they can't. They cannot go it alone. They will not sail off because they cannot sail off. This is not to prove a point tonight. I mean, it's not to prove a point on the basis that you've got to have something. It's for you to see that the human nervous system will not turn. Even little dinky ships like the Nina and the Pinta will not just turn them loose and go sailing off, and no chance of them coming back or not coming back. Because there is every chance of them coming back. Because they go out and they're in debt. They go out and they've got to come back. If they go out and even they stay a long time. Some of the explorers died in the foreign lands. But when they died, they had every intention of going back. Which is the same thing when you get down to it. Their memory went back. That which sent them, the king heard. He knew, there was no doubt, that had he not died, he'd have come back. I knew that. There's no doubt. He wouldn't have sent him. Life knows what it's doing. Talking about investitures and talking about, well, specifically about having to start a new bloodline. Since we're having such swimming success tonight, I guess we can take out a second for an aside. Has anybody ever considered that life does not seem inclined to come up with any kind of new forms of government? You have had the good old standards for as long as history has gone, of the aristocracy, the oligarchies, plutocracies, you know, the rules by the virtuous, the rules by the divinely ordained, the rules by the few, the privileged few, the rule by the wealthy, but all of the Olas and the Plutos and the Arrows. But if you notice, life has not come up with new ones. And how about all the other possibilities? And I didn't name them all. We've had, you know, the rule by the wealthy, the rule by the enlightened, the rule by the wise, the rule by the few, the privileged few, the peerage, the rule by the strong. How about the other possibilities? I don't have to make up Latin names or anything for them, but why didn't they ever come up? How about this possibility? Of course, everybody understands this is really an aside and has nothing to do with I'm just making little jokes to give us a breather here and a timeout for you to collect yourselves. I started to say collect your thoughts, and I didn't do that. But how about there are other possibilities. I'm sure, I can just bet you're going to laugh at some of these, and I'm not necessarily a joke. But why not, without me thinking of the names for them, why hadn't there been the possibility or the attempt to have the rule by the shyest? The rule by the dumbest. You know, why not? The rule by the shortest. The rule by the angriest. The rule by the loudest. The rule by the ugliest. Why not? Why has life never? It's always on the basis, well, there seems to be historically, after it happens, apparently out there, that there was some justification that this group of people, say, took over. Because it turned out that they were, during that time, the most civilized. That's the theoretical background and basis of an aristocracy, of rule by aristocracy. They were the most virtuous. They were the most civilized. And so it was just natural that they rise and exert leadership. Them dance forward and the people follow. Or the wealthiest. At other times, a plutocracy. That certain time and certain place on life's body on this planet is involved in some kind of burgeoning or blossoming mercantile society, and it would just seem appropriate that the leadership just naturally start coming out of those who are best at what seems to be the driving fires of that society. Those who have made the most money, been the most successful. The rest of them begin to look to them just naturally as leadership. But look at all the other possibilities. There's been groups of people that never got rich and didn't seem to have any virtue. Real dumb people. Why hasn't life come up with this, at least theory, or try it once or twice, or at least a theory, with some name for it, a rule amongst these people of the dumbest? They need a ruler, and so what are you going to have? Out of that, there's a bunch of dumbos. Get the dumbest. There's this bunch of real hairy, hoary, ugly group. What would be more natural than, all right, find out is there an ugly of the ugly? Is there a creme de la creme of the ugly folks? If there is, let him be the leader. Never happens, does it? Did anybody think all that was a joke? That there seems to be internally a natural kind of leadership inside of each person's so-called, so assumed, so thought of my individual personality, that there is some kind of leadership. You certainly have had no occasion to ask yourself whether you seem to be internally led, and you're part of the dialogue that seems to be at any time in charge, being led by your most virtuous parts or by your most financially successful parts. Do you sometimes listen, though, when you're trying to make a decision, apparently, or you're discussing something with you, and it seems to be that the part of you that at times past has been able to turn a profit seems to have the loudest voice, or you seem to be inclined to give it more credence? Are you not at that time under a plutocracy? Or then again, if you seem to have come out on the bad end of a deal and got taken again, and you're trying to plot revenge, and I don't know, it seems like that you better not try it because the guy will probably even hurt you worse if you try revenge. And then suddenly you think, that's the way life goes. He'll pay for that. People, that kind of ill-gotten gains of cheating me, he'll never love and enjoy it that much. And suddenly, there for at least a split second, you are under the authority of an aristocracy. That I am being led by virtuous, humane, enlightened people, or a ruler. Do you not? But does anybody take any notice when you're a lout? When you're a bozo? Does anybody pay any kind of homage that I have been under the sovereignty in the last few minutes of the dumbest, the loudest, the crudest? Nobody finds it interesting that life has never done that. The life doesn't even talk about it. Nobody ever even thought about it. I'll tell you what life would say, those of you that think it's even getting more obtuse tonight in here. If life had the answer, if I could make life answer and it wanted to right now, and it'd say, hey, I covered all that a long time ago. I gave you an anti-God, didn't I? Doesn't the whole world have some anti-God, a demon? And you'd have to say, yeah. And life would say, well, don't bug me. I took care of all that. Work out the details amongst yourselves. That's it. And of course, as Kyrie pointed out, the anti-gods, the Satans, the Lucifers, the destroyers of the world, seem to either have no PR man, or if they got one, I guess it must work in the Wyoming branch of the William Morris Agency. That is, he has never reported into life, that aspect of life that does continually have to pay homage to that which it would call the anti-sovereign, the dumb, the short, the loudest, the ugliest. If you get in a position that you can look back on the old world intelligence and look upon what would appear to be its kind of politics, its kind of courtly customs, the way that your old world had been arranged, if you can get away from it far enough and look back, you can realize insouciantly that it don't bother you, but you can realize that everybody's on the tape. However life has wired up your nervous system, whatever life has turned you into being as a thinking creature, to help keep you there, it has put you on the tape that life is continually slipping a fiver under the table behind his back and you think it's to you. Old world intelligence, ordinary consciousness could not continue to operate were it not on the take. Again, I can point out that no one uses this picture, and nobody would ever thought of this, but your intellect, what seems to be your interest, what seems to be the verbal, the humane part that seems to be your driving force in life, that seems to be your center of gravity, that seems to be the locus of all your dreams, fears, hopes. The thing is on the take. And it's on the take on this basis, that all of the kinds of ordinary payments that seem obvious, that seem self-evident, are not enough for anyone. It is as though life has set up everyone, given them a job. You're a custom inspector. You're in charge of Form 274-906. And it sets you up in this job. And then apparently, once you see it, with you and everybody else, it gives the impression that it's continually got you on the take, kind of give me a little something extra, because even if it doesn't go into details, it just says because, and you nod because you know what because is, because of this shitty job I got, because of the boring life I lead, because of the pressures I'm under, because of me having to deal with all these other dunderheads, because I don't make enough, because I'm going to die, and I'll never get any better than this. And it's as though life goes, here's a little something on the table. The intellect ends up, man's ordinary verbal currency ends up debased because of the fact, from the view of doing something like this, on the basis that everything you have gotten was ill gained. Not literally, but the feeling is, once you begin to see it, once you can begin to see it in this way, it is the impression that what I got is in some way, at least partially, it's tainted money, it's funny money, I didn't earn it, somebody gave it to me as some kind of bribe, I don't even know why. It was like just somebody said, here, and I took it. You didn't have a choice, and it was like you took it, and somebody went, of course, it's somebody's life. But it's like I have been filled with this, and something's not right about it. It's as though I have been told things, and it was bribes. It wasn't real money. It was like a continual, it wasn't enough money. I never got actually paid. It was as though somebody would say, well, here's a 5. We'll catch you up to date in a little bit. Here's a 10. Next time, we'll get current. The big payoff's coming. There is an extended version of that that has to do with, you can look at it as a kind of unrecognized regal economics, not Reagan, regal. It's like the king's family mode, and it's wherein within a given state. I'll leave it to you as whether I'm actually talking about a location or whether I'm actually talking about a location. Is there can appear to be a free competitive marketplace. Are we talking about ideas or potatoes? I don't know. Except, unbeknownst, except for those involved, all of the operations, all the franchises are to the king's family, or at least his close friends, in-laws. That which seems to be competitive operations going on. There's over here somebody selling potatoes, and over here somebody else selling potatoes. That both of them are cousins of the king. The only reason that they are selling is they have the authorization of the king to do it. But from those outside, there is a free market of sorts. There is some kind of competitiveness in the marketplace. And now forget for a second what you might think is some sort of negative view that you could take from being an outsider, look at it another way. That you have all the appearances of a free market. You have all the appearances of competitiveness going on. In fact, the king could let it take off. He could let some of his cousins actually get into some competition. One of them try to sell better potatoes or cut the price. He could let it go for a bit. But as long as it's all within the family, no one will ever get hurt, because the king can stop it. It is all in control, and there's the appearance of a free market. I gotta admit to you, since the tape's probably running out, that we're not talking about potatoes. The operations, the movements of trying to go from one place, of trying to go to an old world, of trying to go to a moribund society, an area of your own verbal nervous system, and to go somewhere else. It would seem to be at the old place, and if you don't watch it in the new place, but right now we're talking about in the ordinary establishment of the human nervous system, there appears to be a free market. That I can believe one thing, I can think one thing, I can think something else. All you got to do is get away from that and be able to look back, to have that kind of rear view vision. But you've got to get in a new area to see it, and you see that everything was on the, everyone and everything was on the take, and all that which apparently was free, all that which was open, all that which was in competition, ideas, words. Within a certain context, there was a kind of freedom. There was a market out there that you could go over here and you could buy potatoes here, you could buy potatoes over there, and sometimes the price varied a little bit, but what you didn't know was that the king owned them all. They were there through his acquiescence, and at any time he can close anybody up, he can change all the prices. But rather than you worry about being outside, look at it from the inside view. As long as it is on that basis, and even if there is the appearance that there is some operational reality to competition, that they may get in a small price war, they will never get hurt. If one of them starts getting hurt, one of the cousins that, hey, this other guy, I don't know why, my other cousin's going nuts. He's got potatoes down to the point that even he's not making a profit. I just got to tell the king, and the king says, and that's the end of it. Or if the guy hesitates for a minute, it's out, and they put in another cousin. As long as you're dealing with the king's family economic mode, that kind of model, no one ever gets hurt. If you go outside the marketplace, if you leave the world of potatoes, as delicious as they may be, and you get into your own nervous system, and there seems to be an area wherein there are competitions for your thoughts, for your attention, wherein you apparently can read that, let us say that you're one of the world's great Tories, but you can go and pick up, if you had nothing else to do, and especially if it was laying there free, a liberal, a left-wing political magazine and read it. And even say, well, I can read it, and even I can give it a fair reading. I know what it's basically going to say. It probably won't change my mind. Well, I don't know whether it might change my mind a little. I'll give it a fair reading. That apparently I can think of other things. You are in the midst of a marketplace, and you don't know it, that it's the king's family model. No one is going to get hurt in that marketplace. There is no one idea that is going to so overwhelm others as to put them out of business. Not in the old world. Allow me to be blunt. In the old marketplace, no one idea was so trounce, harm, through some kind of free, through any kind of competition, another idea as to replace it, as to put it out of business. You can bounce back and forth, and apparently there is some competition that you can apparently think, well, I'll buy potatoes over here. But now next week the price goes down, I'll buy here. Next week it goes down back over here, well, I go over here. That I can apparently consider. I can apparently change my mind. I can apparently actually come up with new ideas. You're in a boobs game with everybody else. Because life has the marketplace arranged. And inside that marketplace, inside that apparently free and fairly open marketplace of ideas, things are so arranged that no one is going to get hurt. That is, no one is going bankrupt. Nobody is going out of business. Well, some nights are harder than others. Well, since we found a high, easy spot, I guess I'll just stop. One little thing. That periodic mention I make that if indeed life was producing would-be explorers inside its own system, people, let us say, not dissimilar to you people that might be interested or think you are in this, and then rather than them actually sailing off and getting into trouble somewhere through activities such as this, let's assume that this may be, that this, you think this may be, rather than that, life puts up this kind of stuff for you to get involved with so that you won't actually get involved with this kind of stuff. I do not ever bring that up in some way to give out a subtle message. I'm not trying to hint, and even when I say, as I have before, that if life was doing that, if life gets people involved with such as this, the few people that have the ability, that have the inclination, that are wired up, made in such a way that they might sail off, that life comes up with such as this to help them believe they're sailing off somewhere so that they won't get involved with such as this, it might help them sail off somewhere. And then, I have said before, I said, hey, if that was true, look at it this way. There's no way you'd ever know. All right. I do not say that in any way to give you a subtle message to tell you that it might be true, that it could be true. That's true enough the way I put it. But I'm not trying to give you some subtle message that you would never know, that you'd never get involved. I will tell you this, what I was going to wrap it up with tonight. If you found an activity that you thought was a kind of sail-away activity, and then me saying it could be activity that life comes up with, a kind of subtle distraction for certain malcontents, that the activity, rather than helping you sail away, could be activity that says, this is to help you sail away, so that you get involved with that, so that you wouldn't get involved with any kind of activity that might really help you sail away. So rather than being faced with what I left it at sometimes of saying, hey, even if that was true, you'd never know, there's no way you could know. That's not exactly true. Even since I told you I wasn't giving you any sort of literal hint of any kind. But anybody who still worries about it, to say that there's no way you'd ever know, which most of you that were listening at all, is the part that struck you, but yeah, that's a fact. Even if that's not true or whether it is true, if it is true, there's no way you'd ever know. That's not exactly true. And I was going to say, there is kind of a little test. That if you was involved with something and you thought, wait a minute, what if this is just to keep me from actually finding the kind of stuff that I won't be doing? There is kind of a way to tell. If whatever you're involved with was real serious, or even if whatever you're involved with got real serious, a word to the wise, you could take that darn well as a pretty good, may I say, hint. Other than that, how are things?